Our reading this morning is by Reverend Elizabeth Tarbox, entitled Storm Watch. I was hurting, so I went to the beach. The icy beach with sand pitted by near-frozen spray from an ocean that roared and rolled and drove a million pebbles before it. I hardly noticed the Turner sky and the lonely beauty of the Gurnet, for the tears on my cheeks were part wind-wrought and part anger at the unfairness of a world where good people suffer, children are hungry, and no one counts the tears. "Tell me what to do," I cried. But my voice was thin, and the words froze in the wind and fell lifeless to the sand. Then I saw the gulls, 2 or 3 here and there, with that gray-flecked look of fledglings, and I wondered how they survived the brutality of a winter no one warned them would be coming. But gulls ride the waves and face into the wind. They ride each wave as it comes. That is how they do it. It is the only way. If we follow their example, we will ride the waves, take each new challenge and face it so we can see what is coming and prepare ourselves. If we stay together and face the wind, we may be able to ride out this storm and the next until the wind stops roaring and the waves become calm. For all its noise and threat, the ocean encroaches only a few yards up the beach each day before it retreats. If we ride the waves and face the wind, we shall still be together tomorrow when the storm is over and the ocean is quiet. Since I wasn't here last week, I can say here we are at the beginning of a new year. But we bring so much of the old year with us into this one. It doesn't exactly feel like a fresh start, as some New Years do. We bring the fiscal cliff. Come on, fiscal cliff, you keep following us. We bring the violence and fighting in the Middle East. We bring our lingering grief and sadness about the loss of innocent life in Newtown, and our own more personal losses. And we face new tragedies every day, like the horrific treatment of women in India that has been in the news lately. So how do we handle this unspeakable loss and tragedy? How do we embrace the joy of a new year when we have carried with us all this sorrow? Is it possible to feel both? What do we do when we are feeling both? Should we feel guilty when we enjoy that first laughter or smile after loss? What happens when sorrow and joy meet? These are the questions we ask together this morning. To begin, I thought I would share with you just a few things that really helped me to get through the first part of this winter, hard as it was. One comes from a great source, a man whose wisdom you heard some of during the installation sermon, our great teacher, Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers, in addition to being a lovable TV host to millions of children, was also an ordained Presbyterian minister. He said this: "When I was a boy, and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, "Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping." To this day, he said, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in this world. Today we are faced with so many scary things on the news, and sometimes in our own lives. It's incredibly overwhelming. These events and images challenge not only our own sense of safety, but also our worldview, our sense of the order of the universe, our ability to move through our daily lives. Sometimes watching the news or answering the phone or reading an email, I want to crumple under the weight of tragedy. And at those times, I draw on Mr. Rogers' advice. I look for the helpers. And so that is what I did in the wake of the Newtown tragedy. In the midst of all that horrible footage, and in my opinion, completely irresponsible reporting gave us so much footage to horrify us, I looked for the helpers, and I found them. Some of you may have heard that in the wake of the Newtown shootings, the Westboro Baptist Church had threatened to disrupt the funerals of those killed that day. For several years now, members of the Westboro Baptist Church, folks, this is not a church, this is a hate group, have practiced funeral disturbances because they believe that God is punishing people for allowing gay marriage. I'm not even going to dignify that bad theology with more remarks. I'm just going to ask you to imagine being a grieving family member, barely holding yourself together, and then having to worry about a hateful picket line outside your loved one's memorial service. Enter the helpers. On the day of the wake for Sandy Hook School Principal Don Hochsprung, people began arriving early at the service. Not just family members and friends, not just residents of Newtown, but people from across Connecticut and into New York and Massachusetts. But they did not go inside. Instead, they quietly gathered at some distance from the building and began to link arms, slowly forming a human chain, encircling the memorial site with their peaceful vigil of love. Hundreds of strangers joined arms in silence to create a wall of love, to hold grief, and to keep the voices of hatred out. And they stood that way for hours. And one remarkable thing was, some of these helpers were quite surprising. Yes, there were family friends who gave up their places inside to stand outside and protect the service. And yes, there were lines of policemen and firemen who volunteered to protect their community in yet another way. But there were also, among the human chain, members of the rough and tumble motorcycle group, the Patriot Guard Riders. They were there too, in their leather and their chains, arms linked in love. People see us and just think we're bad, said Jim Hannigan, a rider from New York. But we're not like that. Solidarity, that's what this is all about. Solidarity. Just when I thought I could not watch another second of bad news, there they were, all those helpers, telling me something good about the world to balance out at least some of the bad, to give me hope, to move me forward in my grieving. It doesn't make the disasters go away, but look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Another thing that really helped me was some advice I found when researching how to talk to children about traumatic events. I was thinking of this when my sister and I were talking about what, if anything, to say to my niece and nephew after the Newtown tragedy. But I have also, unfortunately, been in the position to talk to groups of children about other deaths, shootings, and traumatic events when I was working at the UU Urban Ministry in Roxbury. It is so hard to know what to say to children when you yourself don't understand how something so sad could have happened. At times like that, I was so grateful to have experts to turn to for advice. Nancy Rappaport is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and director of school-based programs for the Cambridge Health Alliance. She offers us a helpful strategy that's commonly used for anxiety in children, but which is so helpful to us adults too. Worried thought, brave thought. She says, we teach kids to counter a worried thought with a brave thought, and to know that although the worried thought may come back, the brave thoughts are always there as well. A worried thought might be, a shooter will come to my children's school and there is nothing I can do about it. With the brave counter, school shootings are still rare, and countless people are working hard to make them rarer still. If you're going to talk to your children, start with a brave thought, she said. If the worried thoughts return while you are talking, acknowledge them out loud with your child. It's all right to show that you too worry, but then bring a brave thought back again. If you sense anxiety in your child, you could even share the same strategy. And remember that you don't have to get it right in one single talk. In fact, perhaps the most important thing to remember, she says, is that talking to your children isn't the goal. It's talking with your children that will matter in the long run. And I think for us, it's talking with others in our families, our circles of friends, and in this faith community that matters in the long run. This is how we will get through this winter and other winters of our souls. So that was the first part that I wanted to share with you this morning, thoughts on how to get through hard times and events, even when we don't understand them. And the second part is about this time after hard times. This time we were in at the holidays. This time we are in now. When life is starting to get back to some kind of normal, but we are feeling that we are not quite there yet. That normal would be inappropriate somehow, or that our normal has changed. This is the part of the sermon where we wonder together what happens when joy and sorrow meet. And here are the words that have helped me so much in my struggle with that question. They come from the same struggle that a member of the First Parish Unitarian Universalist in Canton was having when trying to find words for the celebration of Hanukkah at her church just after learning of the Newtown shootings. She was to lead over 200 congregants in a Hanukkah celebration, and she struggled with how they could possibly celebrate anything that night. Here is what she said on Friday night, December 14th, 2012. "I want to begin tonight with a bit of Talmud," she said. And for those of you who don't recognize that word, the Talmud is another sacred text in Judaism, in addition to the scriptures, the Torah. It captures the oral Torah, which is a tradition of explaining what the scriptures mean and how to interpret them and how to apply the laws. "I want to share," she said, "a theoretical debate that is found in the Talmud, where the following question is asked. What should happen if a group of people on their way to a wedding encounter another group of people on their way to a funeral? Which group ought to stop its procession and allow the other to continue ahead? An argument can be made that the wedding procession ought to yield before the funeral. An argument can be made that the funeral ought to stop and let the wedding procession proceed toward its celebration. And what does the Talmud suggest? It teaches that the wedding procession needs to go forward. Those who are rejoicing and building for the future take precedence. That's the answer. Although it's hard to imagine how one can ignore a death, it's hard to imagine how the wedding guests could possibly carry on as if they hadn't encountered a funeral. How can anyone be fully happy when something sad has touched his or her life? Of course, it's not only in this one theoretical circumstance that joy meets sadness. Whenever Jews have a wedding and are so naturally happy, we break a glass under the huppah to remind ourselves that there is always something broken and painful in the world. Nevertheless, we do have the wedding. We still rejoice. You might say we do so because we are commanded to rejoice. That is how I feel this evening, she said, after the news of the great tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. It is sad. It is frightening, painful, confusing, and inexplicable. It's enough to make us want to pause and hold hands. We are just like the people in that passage from the Talmud. It's just not a wedding. Instead, it's Hanukkah, and we are here to light candles and rejoice with each other in this great community. But so much sadness. Can we have this service? Can we have our fun tonight? Actually, my answer is yes. We have to do so. We might not do so with total abandon as we might have, but we need to be here. We are obliged to light our candles, to acknowledge tonight's pain, and to remember as well other hard times, and then hope and pray for better times. Life, even if it is painful, goes on. Quietly, life goes on. Quietly, gratefully, humbly, l'chaim, to life. When my grandfather died years ago, my mother sang at his bedside and at his funeral. She wasn't sure she could make it through. How can you sing at your own father's funeral without breaking down? How can you go on living without your parent? You do it by putting your all into what brings you joy and life and comfort. For my mother, this is singing. At her father's hospital bedside, she sang, "My life flows on in endless song," the song I have chosen for our closing hymn this morning. My life flows on in endless song, above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far-off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? My mother talked about this experience of singing at her father's deathbed with her minister, Reverend Bob Miller, who she loved dearly. And he helped her in her grief and accompanied her as she rebuilt her life after such a loss, slowly finding joy again and prioritizing the living, 2 young daughters eager to celebrate life. And Bob always chose that hymn near February 24th, the day my grandfather died. Years later, when Bob was nearing the end of his life and memory was failing him, his wife brought him to church. He wasn't recognizing many people at that time, but when he saw my mother up front sitting with the choir, there was a spark of recognition. My mother remembers that she could almost see his mind working, trying to place who she was. And at the end of the service, he came up to her and said, "How can I keep from singing?" Adrian Rich writes, "Our hearts are moved by all we cannot save. So much has been destroyed. We have to cast our lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. We have to cast our lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. We have to cast our lot with the helpers, with those who join arm in arm, protecting grieving families and preventing cruelty, with wedding parties, with wave-riding gulls, with brave thoughts, with singing. We have to cast our lot with those who, age after age, reconstitute the world. L'chaim, to life. Amen, and blessed be.